So the sound is turned down. It's still going through the system, but it's turned down, so it didn't sound like I'm in an auditorium. And so we're recording every session. There is a book for every person to get. Each week, lessons will be given out. And we will record every single week for the purpose of if you miss a week, because Revelations is one of those studies that if you miss a week or two, you will fall behind, and then you will come in and not have a clue where we're at. And then you'll get frustrated and say that Revelations is too hard, and I can't study it, and I don't know what it means. It's not helpful. And so, and a lot of people get that way. And so that's a good question. Besides 3 years ago when I did it, how often have you seen people read or study the book of Revelations? That's a good question. Do we read or study? Have you anybody seen that? You've been to churches where they study it. So here's what I've noticed about churches. Churches, pastors tend to either one of two things. They tend to be at the extremes. They either run from Revelations and they never speak on it, or that's all they speak on. They go one of two extremes, and that's that's all they speak on. David Jeremiah does a good job for the most part, tries to balance that, but he spent a lot of time on the book of Revelations, but he does other things as well. But it's another reason is you see what's called expository preachers like MacArthur, and that expository means nothing more than you go through verse by verse. Well, he took the book of Ephesians, which is 6 chapters, and took 2 years to go through it. So think how long it takes the book of Revelations to go through when you think of all the other books that are involved in end times prophecy and what happens with that. And so it becomes a big challenge to understand and see what you're supposed to do. But anybody here read the book of Revelations every year? If you're reading through the Bible in a year, maybe somebody hits it that way. But do you read? And I guess the first question is what do you get out of it? Is it a struggle, or for most people, or is it? Yeah, and we'll jump into that in a second here. So grab your note outline, and we'll just jump into it a little bit. And here's the purpose of Revelation. The first one, it says to encourage believers who are enduring persecution. And so right now at that time, the Roman Empire at that time, so Christ asked John to write this book down to the 7 churches, and we'll talk about that as we move into chapter 3, the 7 churches, and towards the end of chapter 1, he'll tell you who the 7 churches are. But to encourage them, because Romans were in the process of persecuting Christians at that point. And so there was a lot of things going on. And that God is ultimately in control and has a plan for future. It is written in a special literary form called apocalyptic. And all that means is that it uses symbols and imaginary imagery to reveal secret purposes of God for the present and the future. And so there's a lot of imagery. And here's where the struggle comes in with people. Because let me ask you a question. Have you wondered that one of the reasons that most people are very confused about Revelations is because people who seem to have a lot of education seem to argue about this book a lot? Is that not a true statement? And we'll talk about pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, pre-millennial, amillennial, post-millennial, all these different things that you talk about. But there seems to be a lot of arguments as to what's going on. And here's the reason. When you get into this type of literary form, it all comes down to how much is figurative and how much is literal. Is he literally telling me this? Is John seeing something that's happening in the future? And for example, the idea that John cannot comprehend what a tank looks like or what a nuclear missile looks like. And so he sees these things, and so he comes up with his idea, because it says, write down what you see. And let me ask you a question. What do you think about write down what you see? Have you ever tried to do that with people? As a matter of fact, I had people, we sit down and I have something happen and we just go through the whole thing. And then the last 10 minutes I stop everybody and say, I want you to write down what happened today. You will not believe how diverse those stories can be. And as a matter of fact, you might wonder at some times if we're talking about the same story. And we're going to talk about this starting this week as we get into the Gospels, because everybody wants to contradict the Gospels because, are we talking about the same thing? It's different guys looking at the same thing that happened during the course of their time and determining what it meant. And so you have John, who's supposed to write down what he sees. So God didn't say, hey, take a pen and I'm going to dictate to you and you're going to write it down. He said, I'm going to show you something, and I want you to write it down. So here's where we go with that. Was he writing in ways that he could express? He can't say, hey, by the way, a tank came, a B-52 bomber flew over and dropped a bomb. He has no idea. So maybe that's the locust. I don't know, could those be helicopters? And so you start to get to that. And so we come up to why. So that's literary. But he's trying to explain it in a way that he can only explain it. It'd be interesting for us to go back 1,000 years and try to explain stuff in our language and how it worked. And so that becomes part of the issue. And so that's where a lot of these different belief systems have come from. Some of it is the Revelations isn't black and white. And let me give you an example. Pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib. That's when we'll get to that when the church is raptured. The Bible's not black and white. I'll give you the strengths and weaknesses of each one, and you get to make your own decision. I've actually changed. I used to be a post-tribber, and I'm against that now. And I'll explain why when we get to chapter 16. I tend to lean towards mid-trib right now. But I'll explain that as we get to it. But if you grab your note outline, in the back, you'll see in Appendix 2, you'll see a thing called Glossary of Terms. Susan needs to stop texting us. So, yeah, in the back of the book, you'll see Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 written down at the bottom. Appendix 2 is Revelation Glossary of Terms. This is what it looks like. There's 2 pages of it. It's all these terms that are pretty technical, but we'll explain what they mean in pretty easy terms, and then we'll go over them as we go. And so so you can just start to look through that as I spoke. And sometimes I will, if I start to run over you and I say a word that you don't know, first of all, look on it in the glossary of terms, or raise your hand and ask me to explain, to explain what I just said, or what term I just used. You get into a lot of theological terms and a lot of concepts that are theological. Let me ask you a question. Let's just take the first term. It says millennium. How many know what that means? What millennium actually means? Okay, so a couple people know what that means. Premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial. Those are all different theological positions about the millennial kingdom. How many people know that? Raise your hand. Okay. So we got a couple people that know that. So the rapture, tribulation, pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, abomination of desolation, the Antichrist, false prophet, Armageddon, eschatology. Let me just stop at eschatology. Eschatology is what we are doing right now. Eschatology is the technical term for the study of the book of Revelations or the study of end times. And the reason they don't say the book of Revelations is because we are going to get into a ton of books of the Bible to deal with this. I don't know if you know, there are more verses that deal with the end times in the New Testament than there are chapters in the New Testament. Did you hear me? There's more verses, 340 verses that deal with the end times in the New Testament, not just the Old Testament, in the New Testament. And it's just amazing how much time the Bible devotes to this. And it's just, because it is complex, so many people have walked away from it. And so let's jump into your note outline again and say, hey, so what's the big revelation? Number one, the big revelation that we learn in the book of Revelations, Jesus is coming back. He's coming back for his second time. Why? To take his church to be with him. So that's right there. grab your Appendix 2 and look up the rapture. Rapture. And look what it says. It's derived from a Latin word rapio, meaning caught up. The rapture teaches us Christ will ascend from heaven and call those who know him into heaven. Those who are alive will be transformed into the resurrected body. At the same time, the dead in Christ will also receive the resurrected bodies in a twinkling of an eye. This is the first part of the resurrection. So that is the rapture. The church is raptured. Underneath there, you'll see tribulation, and that we'll talk about that in a minute. And then you see three forms of the rapture, and those are three different views, three different ideas: pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, and post-tribulation. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Number 2, he's coming back to judge the world. He's coming back to judge the world. So every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God, and Jesus will judge the nations. He'll judge each word that was said out of everybody's mouth. He will be the judge. And it's interesting is, you see some things that helps you to know that we're talking about the second coming of Christ, because you'll see some stuff in the Old Testament, we'll get to this in a little bit, that talks about Jesus is going to be here and all the nations will bow down to him. Well, did any nation bow down to Jesus at his first coming? Not one. Not one. His own nation didn't bow down to him. His own nation helped crucify him during that time. And so there was no bowing down to Christ. At his second coming, they'll bow. They'll bow, all right. And the last one is to rule the world. And he's going to rule the world during his millennial kingdom, and we'll see that. What is going to happen when Jesus comes back? These are the three words that we're going to talk about. The first one is called the tribulation. And we're going to show you where this comes from in a bit. First, grab your Appendix 2. Tribulation. A period preceding the glorious return of Christ, where suffering on earth will be unequaled in history of the world according to Christ. The period is 7 years divided into three parts: the first half, the midpoint, and the last half. And we'll talk about where that comes from right now. As a matter of fact, if you scroll down on to page 2 of your note outlines, we're going to show you where this comes from, and this will be a passage we talk about multiple times, but we're going to show how we've come up with this idea of a second coming of Christ and a tribulation. And so you're going to grab appendix number 1 and page number 2. So appendix number 1 looks like this. And then you're going to grab page number 2, which has Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 through 27 in it. And you'll see it says at the bottom, it says, see appendix 1 as well. And so we're going to read this, and I'm going to talk to you about this. And so what's happening is Daniel is in the midst of prayer. And he's praying really hard because something happens. He remembers a prophecy that said that the Jews were going to be held captive for so many years, and after so many years that God was going to free them. And so he's praying. He says, when is this coming? Lord, I want this promise to be fulfilled. And when is this coming? And so what it says is, starting in verse 20, it says, while I was speaking, and this is Daniel talking, and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and making my request to the Lord my God on his holy hill. While I was still in prayer, Gabriel, and Gabriel we know is one of three angels named in the Bible: Satan, Gabriel, and Michael, and the archangel Michael. And Gabriel was always known as the messenger angel. And this is the second time he's come to Daniel. And he says, Gabriel, the man I'd seen in an earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice, which was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He instructed to me and said, Daniel, I now come to you with insight and understanding. As soon as you began to pray, a word went out, which I came to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. Here's where he goes. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression. And what he's talking about is before that prophecy, which is going to be fulfilled, which means you're going to be freed, and you're going to get to rebuild Jerusalem. If you remember, the Babylonian Empire had come in and absolutely destroyed Judea and taken it over. They tore the temple down. They tore the walls down. They tore everything down. There was nothing left of the city. And if you remember, contemporaries, people like Daniel were taken captive, while people like Jeremiah, we call the weeping prophet, which you guys read, hardest, most frustrating book in the Bible for me to read. That guy, every chapter, I call him Eeyore of the Bible. He just was, every chapter is doom and gloom. Jeremiah was stuck back in Jerusalem. So he didn't get taken captive and carried off. He was one of the remnant that was left back in Jerusalem, and there was nothing there. There's no walls to protect him. There's nothing. And that's why he's called the weeping prophet. It was just horrible to be there. And so Daniel's asking what's going to happen, and here he goes, and he says, here's what's going to happen. 77s are decreed for your people and for your holy city to finish transgression and put an end to sin. Now, here's where these things, tell me if these things have happened. To put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy he says place. I think it's person in there. Most holy place. Has any of those happened? Ever? No. That's going to be a key for us. I just want you to remember that. No one understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So at some time, a word is going to come out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes. And and the anointed one is Jesus Christ. He's talking about. There will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So sevens are in this are blocks of years. So 7 is 7 years. 7 sevens equals 49 years. 7 times 7. For you, those who are not math people, just turn around to Marcus. He's an engineer, so he's a math guy. 7 sevens. So he said 7 sevens are appointed, and then 62 sevens. And I want you to look at this, and you'll see Nehemiah Chapter 2. Remember the prophet Nehemiah? Does everybody remember Nehemiah? Nehemiah was what? What did he do for a living? He was a cupbearer. He's the guy who drank the wine to make sure it wasn't poisonous. What a job. Yeah, let's watch this guy for a little bit. If he falls over dead, don't drink the wine. But he was a cupbearer for the king. I'm trying to remember how to pronounce that. Eradicus, let's say Eradicus was the king. And so he came to, if you remember the story in chapter 2 of Nehemiah, Nehemiah comes to the king, and it says he has a down look on his face. And he always was a joyful guy, I guess. Must be a real positive person. And the king says, what's going on? And he literally says he prayed before he asked him, and he told the king what was going on. And the king says, what do you want from me? He says, I want to go back and rebuild the walls. Because at that point, there was nothing. And he says, I want to go back and rebuild. And the king gives him permission to go back, and he starts rebuilding the walls. There's the start of it. If you actually look it up, it took 49 years to rebuild. And look what it says in there. Look what it says. He says, to finish your transgression, he says, no one understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, that's what he did in Nehemiah chapter 2, until the anointed one, the rulers come, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So 7 sevens is 49 years. 62 times 7 is, yeah, there you go. There you go. Thank you, Deb. And he says, it will be built with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. And if you remember the story of Nehemiah, was that an easy thing? No, matter of fact, he had enemies. Even though he had the king's permission and he had the king's supplies, there's enemies of Jerusalem all around, and they were all worried about it. As a matter of fact, if you remember, he had them set up by families, because he says families will fight for each other, and they all had to wear their swords or a spear while they worked, and he put them in groups, and they even had signals set up. So as you're building down here, if all of a sudden an attack happens over here, you get going over there, and they had it all set up, and it was built in terrible times of trouble. And he rebuilt the wall. And then after that, the temple was rebuilt. It took 49 years to rebuild that. And so that's the first 7. Then he says there's going to be 62 more sevens, which is how many years? Yep, 434. You add those two up, it comes up to 483. Surprise. And it says It will be built in times with the streets entrenchment in times of trouble. Verse 26. After 62 sevens, so after the temple's built, that first 49 years, after Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, where the king says, go ahead and rebuild, it took 7 sevens, which is 49 years. And he says, now there's 62 more sevens, and something's going to happen. He says, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The anointed one will be put to death. It's interesting. When you add those two numbers up, the 7, and you come up with 69 weeks. 69 times 7 equals 483 years. We know for a fact that it was 445 BC when the king made the proclamation. That takes us, and that we actually know the date. That was in May. It takes us to April of 32 AD. Guess what happened on 32 AD? What? Jesus Christ came on a donkey into Jerusalem and announced that he was the Messiah. If you remember during Jesus' whole time, he would always tell people, don't tell him whom I am. Oh, don't say who did this. Remember when he'd do miracles? Because he would say, remember what he'd say? My time has not yet come. Jesus' time came in April of 32 AD when he came down on a donkey and they waved all those palms and he got up and said, I am the Messiah. I am the King of the Jews. That was his announcement. 3 days later, he was dead. But that was his announcement. That was his proclamation. Why? To fulfill this prophecy. To fulfill this prophecy. And so it came about that exactly that way. He said, after 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. Is that not exactly what happened? Jesus came in and announced on April of that day, of April of 32 AD. And you got to remember, back then, the Jews' calendar was only 360 days. And then they would have what they called their leap year. Their leap year they would have where they would actually have an extra week. And they would do things like that. And so their calendar was a little different. When you add it all up, it works out exactly the way the prophecy said. And so that was going to happen. And then something else. And here's where it's a struggle for most people. Because it seems like what's about to happen is almost immediately, correct? Look what it says. After 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. Verse 26, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So here's what we have. 32 AD, Jesus Christ dies. Does anybody know when the city and the temple were destroyed? 70 AD. So in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple and the city and put an end to sacrifices because there was no temple at that point. And so it says, the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue to the end, and desolation has been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And in the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. You see that in your appendix. Until the end, that decree is poured out on him. And here's where we're at. I want you to look all the way over to the left, and you'll see the king Artaxerxes decreed to rebuild the city and its wall, 445 BC. And so you see in that 69 weeks, it was broken down really into 2 7 weeks. 1 7 week and then 162. And the first 7 week was the rebuilding of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. That's why he says there'll be a street and there'll be a trench. That Hebrew word for trench means wall, could mean trench or wall. And so he's talking about the rebuilding of the city. So the temple was going to be rebuilt. The wall was going to be rebuilt. That took 49 years. That's 1 7. 62 sevens after that, which adds up to the 69 weeks, comes 32 AD. And what happened on that day in 32 AD in April, so that's what happened. We don't know. It's very likely Jesus was not born in December. But it's very likely that in April, Jesus died on a cross. So we're kind of close on the whole Easter thing. I don't know what happened to the Christmas thing. I don't know how that all worked, but here's where we're at. And so in 32 AD in April, Jesus comes into Jerusalem on a donkey and declares himself the Messiah. 3 days later, he is cut off / killed. Now, interesting, it immediately says that right after it says that, the anointed one comes, and there'll be 776 to rebuilt streets. Verse 26, after 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. It immediately seems like it says the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. But that, we know, did not happen till almost 40 years later, correct? Now, let me go back, because we are now about to jump into something that has not even happened yet. The tribulation. The last 7 weeks. And so where we're at right now is you see the Messiah revealed, triumphal entry, Palm Sunday. That happened in 32 AD. You see the Messiah executed. That was very quickly. That was only 3 days later. Romans destroyed the temple. That happened roughly 40 years later. And then you see this thing, number 2, called the gap. And we call this a prophetic gap, or some people will call this the age of the church. And where this comes from is... to me, one of the biggest telling points of this is that he's speaking of something that's going to happen in the future. And oftentimes we saw this in prophecy. Prophets, so I was in Colorado once for work. And we're driving up, and we get to the top of these mountains, and we go to this place. It's called like an overlook. And you can see all these mountains. And here's the really cool thing is I would see this mountain, and then I would see the next mountain. And I was so high up, all I could see was these peaks. I couldn't see the valleys. And when I asked them, well, how far is it to that mountain? Well, that's 30 miles. I had no idea the distance in between those two peaks. Prophecy in the Old Testament seems to be very similar to that. They would show different prophecy of things and not be able to tell the distance in between those. And let me give you an example of where this comes from. Even the Jews, even the disciples in Acts chapter 1 did not realize there was a second coming of Christ. You remember after they realized that Jesus had risen, and he's standing there with them, and he's about to go up to heaven. He says, and they asked the question, they said, are you going to establish the kingdom now? Remember they asked that question? And he says, that's not for my time to say when that is. That's God in heaven. And then they go up, and they just stand there, and they stare at him. And they stare up there until an angel comes down and says, he's going to come back the same way he came. They didn't realize that there was two coming of Christ. They took all the prophecy as one coming of Christ. And as a matter of fact, the reasons the Jews are still where they're at is because they don't believe the first coming ever happened, correct? They still don't recognize the second coming of Christ. As a matter of fact, when Christ comes a second time, they're going to think it's the first. Because they didn't see that we were talking about prophecies about multiple times that were going to happen. And they didn't understand that. And so sometimes you get this what's the word I'm looking for? Not telegraphic, like a telescope. Telescopic, that's the word I'm looking for, thank you. Telescopic view of prophecy and history. And so here's where I go with that, because here's what's happening. It looks like these things are happening just consecutively, very quickly. Well, we know there was 40 years in between Jesus Christ dying and the city being destroyed, even though it sounds like it is. And then we go to this thing that says, here's what's going to happen. The people of the ruler, this is middle of verse 26, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue to the end, and the desolation has been declared. Look what it said, verse 27. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And here's where we're at right now. We are jumped that gap of interval in number 2, and we're going to after 1948 AD. And let me explain to you why this person holds to this. What happened in 1948? Does anybody know? Israel was recognized as a nation. And so this person, I don't want to use any technical words. This person is not a covenantalist. This person would be called the dispensationalist. And what he means by that is he believes that this nation, and I agree with him, is going to establish a peace plan with the nation of Israel. And this is the beginning of what is known as the tribulation. The tribulation. So right there it says at the beginning of, after 1948, world leaders peace plan with Israel. And when I say world leaders, we're going to talk about that is the Antichrist. And so who we're talking about is the first one in verse 25, the anointed one, we know it's Jesus Christ. And you know he was cut off, he was killed. But then it says in verse 26, part B, the people of the ruler who will come. That ruler who will come is another prince. Does anybody, this is the NIV translation. If you have other translations, it'll see the prince to come. That is the Antichrist. Grab your glossary, and you'll see a person called the Antichrist on the bottom of page 1 of the glossary. The final earthly king who opposes Christ and attempts to finally destroy the Jewish people. He will be killed at the second coming of Christ along with the false prophet who proclaimed his glories. He, along with the false prophet, will be the first two occupants of the lake of fire. And so the Antichrist is not the devil. The Antichrist is perceived at the end times. The devil is going to create his own trinity. He will be the Father. The Antichrist is the Son, and the false prophet is the Spirit. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He's mimicking, he's copying God. And this is at the end time. And so here's where we're at. People struggle with this because it looks like it's consecutive. But I'm already showing you there's two reasons I say that. First of all, we know that 40 years is not consecutive. The 40 years, it's 40 years after Jesus dies before before the Jerusalem is destroyed. But then go back up. And look what it says that he's going to do in verse 24. 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression. Look what it says. To put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy and anoint the most holy place. We just have said none of that's ever happened. Ever happened in the nation of Israel, nor any other place has that happened. We're talking about perfection that only was found where? The Garden of Eden before the fall. That's what he's talking about. Put an end to sin, perfect righteousness, that's not happening. And so for us to say, well, gosh, because there's some views that would hold that all this stuff has already happened. And that's the post-millennial and the amillennial positions. And my comment is none of that has happened. None of that has happened. And so there's this gap, and that's where they say this gap is. And people call this the age or the gap of the church. And that is God's plan for salvation through Jesus Christ. He created the church, and he created this gap. And where the problem is no one knows how long that gap is. And everybody's debating on when that gap is. And throughout history, there has been multiple people who have determined when the second coming of Christ is going to happen. And guess what? They've all been dead wrong. Some of them to a fault where they've killed themselves. And they've all been dead wrong about it. And that's the gap that we're talking about. And that gap goes to me back to a passage in 2 Peter. It says, God is patient, not wanting anyone to perish, but to all to come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so what he's saying is, I got a plan. And it's through the church that I'm using the church to bring salvation to the world. And I got this timeline. And I'm giving you a lot of time. We know it's been a couple thousand years almost, right? Almost a couple thousand years. For that whole plan, and it's not happened yet. There's some things that are happening right now that start to make that happen. And look what it says that he's going to do in there. Let's go back to 27. It says he's going to confirm which is the Antichrist. He's the Antichrist. Will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. And so that's what he's going to do at the beginning. He's going to have this peace plan that's going to happen. Does anybody know? I had a couple people ask me a question, very intelligent question. Do you know what happened under Trump that one of the reasons they were trying to give him the Nobel Peace Prize? What did he do? He did that, but that has nothing. He started signing peace treaties. Middle East started signing peace treaties. Now, I had a couple people ask me, does that make Trump the Antichrist? I don't believe that. And the next thing I also stated was, those were small peace treaties with really nobody nations. And we're going to get to where I think the Antichrist comes from as we dive into this. And this is going to be weeks in the making to come up with that and where that all comes from. But that peace treaty will be with the entire European nation at that point. And right now, let's just be honest with you. Everybody hates the Jews, including Democrats. I'm just gonna say that as nicely as I can. You know, Biden has still not taken a call from the Prime Minister of Jerusalem, of Israel. You know that, right? The Democrats are not pro-Israel, and I don't agree that that's a good thing. And if you're I said Democrats. If you look at the Democratic Party, if you look at the Democratic Party right now, the Democratic Party right now is anti-Jewish. All of Europe is anti-Jewish. All the Middle East is anti-Jewish. Have you ever wondered why? You ever wondered why? I mean, talk about a hated people. Yeah, everybody wants to pull up racism and, you know, what people have been hated. The Jews have been persecuted throughout the last 2,000 years by far more than any other nation or any other people out there. Why do you think that is? Say that again? Because of Christ? Yep. They're God's chosen people. Yeah. So if you look at the two groups of people that the devil hates, who are they? Who is it? The Jews and who else? The church. The church. The bride of Christ. Yeah.
I mean, these peace treaties are started with the Middle Eastern countries.
Yeah.
And
But
when Abraham and Sarah couldn't have children, and he went in and lied and they had Ishmael. God said, "You will forever war with his offspring."
yeah.
Yeah.
We'll get to this in the thing, but very likely the Antichrist is coming out of one of the 13 nations of Europe.
Yeah, I don't think that's the Antichrist. I just think it's
Yeah, he's the one who's gonna. He's the one who's gonna make. Yeah. So there'll be one person who is the instigator or the developer of this peace treaty with Israel and all these different nations. And that's why people ask specifically, is Trump the Antichrist because of that? And that there's more to it than just what's happening right now. But the Antichrist will be the person who's in charge of. He's going to do something that nobody else has ever been able to do. And I don't know if you know, in the last 1,000 years, do you know how many years of peace the Middle East has had in the last 1,000 years? 100. 1 out of every 10 years, they have peace. 1 out of every 10 years, there's not, I'm not talking about a skirmish. I'm talking about an out-and-out war. 1 out of every 10 years, there's no war. 9 out of every 10 years, 90% of the time, the Middle East is an out-and-out war. Out-and-out war. And and this guy's going to come in, and he's going to do something nobody else has been able to do, and that's to bring up peace to all of them. The Muslims hate the Jews. Let's be honest with you, the Jews are not that nice to Muslim people either. I mean, if you want to look at that, everybody wants to defend the Jews. Well, not everybody. Christians want to defend the Jews, but if you look at it from a humanistic standpoint, the Jews aren't that great of people in the way they treat their neighbors either. And so there's just tremendous hatred in the Middle East for Jewish and everybody else. And they hate each other. And so that's all part of it. So what's going to happen is then you see what he says. In the middle of this, he's going to make peace. He's going to say, I'm going to do a 7-year peace treaty. In the middle of it, he's going to break the peace treaty. And look what it says. And the temple, he will set up the abomination that causes desolation. And what that means is because this has already happened once. A person came in and he did this exact same thing and he called it the Abomination of Desolation. He is going to stand in the temple. He's going to stand on the sacrificial seat of atonement, and he's going to declare himself God, and he says, you will worship me and me only. Period. And by the way, before 666 can happen, that has to happen. So we'll get, because I've had people ask me this question, and I literally we had a relative who believed that taking the COVID vaccine was an act of 666. You will know, first of all, you will know there'll be a black and white decision. God's not going to get you faked into hell. You're going to know. Number two, that happens before. We'll get that in Revelations. There is an actual sequence of events in the book of Revelations. And what the sequence is, the abomination of desolation will happen before 666 is enforced. And so you will know who the Antichrist is. And we'll talk about where the church is at a later time. And so that's where we're at. Does that make sense? And so just be honest with me. Raise your hand if you're still confused. It's okay if you are, because I know it's okay. It's okay. And I'm going to raise my hand too. But where we're at, what I just did right now was the fast version of what we will go over in slow, minute details. I'm just getting you to a point to understand, where's this thing called the tribulation coming from that we're talking about? Where is this 7 years that this thing's going to, where do you come up with that idea? Yeah.
And the other thing is that's historically significant is that one of the big reasons that they fight so much is a very small piece of land.
Yes.
Called the Temple Mount.
That's right.
Which is where the temple was built.
Yeah.
And currently there's a mosque on that piece of property.
Yeah.
But that's why they hate, the two sides deeply fight over this one very little piece of land.
That's where Solomon built the temple?
Yes.
Yeah. So here's where I want to tell you something that we also know that this isn't happening. I want you to go back to verse 27 again. It says, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7, and in the middle of 7, look what it says, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. Let me ask you a question, first of all. Is there any sacrificial system happening in Jerusalem right now? The answer is no. Why? There's no temple. There is no temple. So everybody asks me where we're at. Are we in the tribulation right now? The reason I don't believe we are in the tribulation because there is no way to put an end to the sacrificial system. That's not happening. So what has to happen? Temple's got to be rebuilt. The temple has to be rebuilt. They will reinitiate the sacrificial system, and then there's a possibility of that happening. So could we begin the beginning stages where they sent the peace? And that's what people were asking me as it relates to Trump created these peace treaties with other nations. And the answer I believe is no, because I think Trump has not proven himself to be the peacemaker. Is that a true statement? Yeah, Trump is not a peacemaker. He's a pot stirrer. He's a pot stirrer, not a peacemaker. And so this person is going to come in and have incredible intelligence. And I'll be honest with you, Trump is not noted on both sides of having incredible intelligence. And he's going to be a peacemaker. Trump is not a peacemaker. He's a pot stirrer. And so
He's also made peace treaties in the Middle East where they never have.
So when you can, but when we get to the profile of what this guy's going to look like, he's going to be a very charismatic individual who brings everybody together. Everybody. Trump does not bring Trump separates people. He separates the people that are on his side are very loyal to him, but you know, whether what you want to bet about the vote, and I've had a lot of people say, well, how did Biden get so many votes? Well, there's a couple things. You could say he didn't get them. There's one answer. You could say he didn't. Another answer could be, and is a true statement, is that Trump is the most polarizing candidate we've ever have. And I think the statistic I saw, 40% of the people who voted for Biden didn't vote for Biden. They voted against Trump. And so he's not a bring everybody together kind of person. And so he's not. And if you're a Trump fan, Kerm, you should just shut up and listen to me because I'm telling you that he's not the Antichrist. Some people are claiming him to be the Antichrist. He's not the Antichrist. He's a pot stirrer. A lot of people could say the same thing. How many people would have thought that Hitler was the Antichrist? Of course you would have. He's persecuting the Jews severely. He was not a peacemaker, though, although he did create some peace treaties and then broke them. But he created them not with Israel. He created them with like England and France, and then he broke all those. But he wasn't as big into that, but he was a persecutor of the Jews. There's no doubt about it. But yeah, go ahead, Jody.
Something I've always heard through the years is that Satan is always bringing up somebody to be the Antichrist.
Yes, he is. Why is that, guys? Why does he have to have an Antichrist? He doesn't know. He doesn't know when it is. And so every generation, he has his own version of an Antichrist ready to go. He has his own son of Satan and the Trinity. He has his own false prophet already set up because he doesn't know. Paul even said, hey, and when the Antichrist comes, and there's been many Antichrists, he's talking about that whole concept, that many people, there's an Antichrist in every generation ready to come up. Yeah, man.
That is so confusing to me. Are you talking literal, like that is a person walking around?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like an actual human being on earth?
Yeah.
The Antichrist is a person.
Yeah. So the Antichrist, so we'll get to this. So go back to where it says the Antichrist. No. Yeah, he will come from ties of the Roman Empire, which is Europe. Guys. I mean, this is Italy, this is the Pope, this is where he's going to come from. And we're going to get to I don't want to get into this prophecy. We're not going to get into prophecy about the 13 horns and stuff, but that's the European nation. So let's just get to European Union, I should say. Go ahead. Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, false prophets, false believers. But let's go back to Amanda's questions. Hold on. The Antichrist is a real person. This Daniel 9, just as it said, let me finish. The first person, the first anointed prince was Jesus Christ. He was a real person. The second one is going to be just as real of a person who's going to come here and he's going to do all these things opposite of Christ, Antichrist. And he's going to do these things that the devil's going to want. And the devil is going to have a trinity of his own. He's going to have him as the Father. He's going to have the Antichrist, a real person, as the Son. And he's going to have a false prophet who's a priest. Don't know what religion, but he's going to come out and he's going to be the Holy Spirit. And
Die and rise again, like Christ.
But we don't,
Hold on.
but Jesus doesn't walk the earth. Like,
Not now he doesn't, but he did, and he will. He did, though.
but why does Satan do it every generation?
Well,
Why is it a real person and not
well,
figurative, I guess?
the only reason is he doesn't, unlike God, he doesn't know when the second coming of Christ is, and he knows he has to, that this false prophet has to come out the second time, the second coming of Christ. He doesn't know when it's happening, so he's ready at all times.
Not come to fruition because every leader needs the circumstances to develop them and come.
Sure.
A guy walking around going, if it hasn't
Yeah. That's a correct statement.
somebody in position to be a world that's
That God could use, that Satan could use.
Right. Okay. But it is a human.
It is a human. But I'll be honest with you. If you start to think of let's just talk about the people who are pushing the politics that says, hey, you can murder a baby after he's born. That is nothing more than an antichrist. That is pure evil. Frankly, a person who propagates the idea that you can murder a baby inside the womb of a mother and think that. Matter of fact, let's make that legal. How is that not just pure evil? You know, and so you see that, and you see that on both sides. I see that in the Republican Party, and I see that in the Democratic Party. Things like that are pure, unfactual evil, and we have to.
people that teach that it's not a literal antichrist, it's a spirit of evil.
Yes, we'll get into that. I don't want to throw those terms out yet. So we're going to hold to this thing that it's a physical, real person. And where I struggle with those who don't say that is that then how do you turn around and say that first prince is real? Well, we know for a fact that's Jesus Christ. We know he was the one who was cut off. We know he was a real person on this earth. And we know that the Antichrist is going to be a real person as well. And so that's where we're at. So go ahead. Sure. Mm-hmm.
But, and the reason you can tell the difference with that is because it specifically says how Christ is going to come, and it specifically says how the false Messiah is going to come. So you've got to
Yeah.
you go
And so what he's saying there, and which is true, is there's going to be lots of signs and wonders being done by lots of people. And where's their loyalty going to? Their loyalty is going to be going to this Antichrist. Is who their loyalty is going to be going to, and you'll see that. And so at end times, you'll see a tremendous amount of miraculous, wondrous signs that'll start to take place again. You're going to see that. So go ahead. You can ask a question.
Okay, back to Appendix 1.
Yeah.
How can the gap you're talking about be before the 1948?
Because the gap started after the temple was destroyed.
But it shows it ending before 1948.
Yeah, it should have a.
No. It doesn't say ending before 1948. It just says when it says after 1948, it hasn't started yet. That gap is still moving. It just says that it couldn't happen, that there cannot be the beginning of the 7-year tribulation until after 1948 because the nation of Israel has to be established. So that gap is there's not a date that you have on that. That's why it says after 1948. It still hasn't started. So the only reason the rapture is in there before that is because this person is a pre-tribulation rapture person. So he believes that the church is going to be raptured before the tribulation. So if you believe in pre-tribulation, and we're jumping way into stuff already that I didn't want to jump into. If you believe that, we will not have a clue who the Antichrist is because we'll be gone. The church will be gone. When I say the church, true believers in Jesus Christ. True believers. And I'm going to say something. Every church on the face of this planet will have people who don't get raptured. And they might have come to church every day, every week. But there'll be true. But this person is a pre-trib person. And that's the reason that he believes that. And so if you're a pre-trib person, you're not here. You're gone before any of this happens. Did anybody ever see, what was the movie series? Left Behind series. That person was a pre-tribber. And so you see all of a sudden they're having to try and explain where everybody went. And they got to come up with a whole plan. And I think there wasn't an alien abduction is what they held to. What was that? Did anybody ever watch the series? What did they? No. They had to come up with an idea. They had to come up with a way to explain where everybody went. They had to come up with a way to explain because all of a sudden everybody was gone. Now we know why. It's the shot. It's the vaccine.
COVID-19, it's
COVID-21. And so they have to come up with a way to explain it. You know, if you're a pre-tribber, you have to come up with a way. The government is going to have to come up with a way to explain why millions of people are all of a sudden gone. They've just disappeared. They're nowhere to be found. It's gonna be like the Avengers End Games. They're all of a sudden everybody's gonna be gone. You didn't see that movie, did you?
Accessibility shortcuts.
Yeah, it's talking to me. So it's gonna be like that. So this person is based off of pre-trib. Back to Sharon's question. All that point says is after 1948. It doesn't tell you when that point starts because it doesn't know. We don't know. That's the beginning of the tribulation. And
If it's just any time after 1948, it should be on the other side of the gap.
I agree. Yeah, the rapture should be on the other side of the oil well.
no, it won't. If you're a pre-trib.
Until after 1948.
Oh, I'm with you. Yeah, the rapture would have, you're right. Yeah,
Nations and the rapture.
right.
I read left to right, and that is not right.
Okay.
You don't read.
So I should have redone this then. Here's what he's saying. Here's what he's saying is after 1948, the tribulation could not start until after 1948. The rapture will start. And the reason he has it on the left side is the rapture, if you're a pre-tribber, will happen before the tribulation. That's why it's called pre-trib, pre-tribulation.
It doesn't say tribulation, it says 1948.
But tribulation above the word after.
But he's got starting in the middle at the bottom.
Yeah, see, at the bottom is the 7 years.
3.5 and 3.5.
But
He's
the
got
thing
it
with
coming up.
1948, why it couldn't happen until after that.
Because Israel had to be a nation again.
And Israel was not a nation, recognized as a nation
till 1948.
I get all that, but it's still the wrong spot.
It is. You're right, teacher. It's in the wrong spot.
Yeah, should put a circle around it.
Here's where you're right and you're wrong. You're right, the rapture hasn't happened yet, so it's got to be after 1948. But it happens before the beginning of the tribulation. So if we say that last barrel, that first barrel, it says after 1948 is beginning of the tribulation, the rapture, if you're a pre-tribber, would be to the left of that, because it will happen before the tribulation. If you're a pre-tribber, you will have no clue who the Antichrist is. You will have none of that because you'll be gone. You'll be in heaven. Yeah, I know you do. So it would be on the left-hand side. If
The barrel is not 1948. That could be 1979. That could be 2003. Right. That's to say after. The barrel's not 1948. It's floating around.
It had to be after that because of Israel being recognized as a nation. If Israel still was.
yeah, we understand that. Yeah.
Well, if they still hadn't been recognized, it wouldn't be.
Well, I'm just trying to make sure we're all on the same page and everybody's feeling good. Are we okay? Now here's the thing. Can I do this now? If you're a mid-tribber, you see the 3.5 years and you see that little interval, that little arrow sign in the middle. If you're a mid-tribber, that's where the rapture takes place. If you're a post-tribber, it would be right before the last what do you want to call that? Can or cylinder? Thank you. Very good word. It'd be right before. It'd be just to the left of the last cylinder. If you're a post-tribber, it'll happen right before Armageddon. The church will be raptured, go up, and come straight back down with Christ. That's because Armageddon is the second return of Christ. Because we go up and we're changed in an instant. We'll talk about that. Okay. I probably shouldn't even have shown this thing. Are we? It is confusing. It is good. So that third cylinder, the third cylinder to the right, that just has to happen after 1948. It's a moving thing that's happening right now, because if it happened today, it would be today. But it could happen tomorrow, or it could happen next year, or it could happen 5 years from now. Yeah. Yes, very good. Technically, it has to happen after today. Yes, it can happen. Yeah. It has to happen sometime between now and midnight. It's a moving target, and that's where the struggle is nobody knows where it starts, and this is where people are drawn to the book of Revelations. Because they know all this stuff is happening, but can you tell me who's going to do it, the Antichrist? And can you tell me when it's going to start? Because I got to go buy a bunch of dry food.
Kind of frivolous to try to do something when God says nobody will know.
It is, but people do it all the time. Isn't it true?
He also gave you clues as to general events.
But we're always to be on the
Would you
lookout.
put together a puzzle when God says you don't have all the pieces?
But we're supposed to be like with the oil. Like we're supposed to be prepared and on the lookout. And be
Well, can we do this real quick? Let us jump down up to the page. How does this affect me? Back page 1. How does this affect me? You'll see some blanks.
Back on the first page.
Yeah. So we went over number 2. We said what's going to happen? The tribulation, the Antichrist, the millennium. We haven't got to the millennium. That happens after cylinder number 4. That's the 1,000-year reign of Christ. That's a 1,000-year reign of Christ. And so that happens, and we'll talk about that as we move into it. Number 3, how does it affect me? 1 Corinthians 4:5. Matter of fact, if you have some verses, if you guys would like to help me look them up, we can look these up together and go through these real quick. Who wants to grab the first verse for me?
I've got it here.
Go ahead and read it, and somebody grab the second verse.
Therefore the judge,
Listen.
therefore judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the heart.
So how does that affect us? How does that affect us? What should we be doing now until then? Or not be doing in this case? Don't be judging. And now this is a tricky thing. Paul says, I judge within the church. I don't judge outside the church. We tend to try to judge the world right now. And that is absolutely what we are not called to do. No one went to hell for being gay. No one went to hell for any other sin. People go to hell for what reason? Denying Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior in their life. And the church tends to want to judge people outside the church. Paul said, I judge within the church, because we are called to judge each other, to spur one another on, to encourage one another, to remove the speck out of our brother's eye. Make sure we move the plank out of our own eye first, it says. But we're called to do that. But what he's saying, do not judge. I don't judge. And my next comment to you is, I don't judge whether a person is saved or not. We should see fruits, correct? We should see things that show us what a Christian is. But whose job is it to judge that? Jesus Christ will judge that. Number 2, who has 1 Corinthians 11:26? Go ahead, read it. Somebody grab the next verse, Colossians. So what are we supposed to do? Proclaim the Lord's death. We're called to proclaim the Lord's death. So communion serves 2 purposes. It has us look backwards to what Jesus Christ did first on the cross, has us look forward to Jesus Christ's return. Proclaim his death. Number 3, Colossians. Proclaim his death. His death. Yeah, our debt to him, his death. We proclaim Jesus Christ did what? He died on the cross for my sins. That's our testimony. Who's got Colossians 3:1-4? Go ahead, read it, Kerm.
Then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ is, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory.
Okay, what are we supposed to do? Set our minds on heavenly things. So, hey, think about this. Everybody in this room did this. When you were a teenager and your kids went away for the week, your parents went away for the weekend, you threw a party. Now, here's the difference. Yeah, Sharon says, no, I never did that. Bull crap, Sharon. So here's the thing. Here's the difference. Mom and Dad told you what day they were coming home. We're going to be home Sunday at noon. What happens if they showed up Saturday at 10 o'clock at night? In a lot of trouble. Maybe one of the reasons Jesus has not told us the exact hour, he wants us to be ready. Let me ask you, so when Jesus Christ returns, what do you want him to look at you and see? I think about that. Well done, faithful servant. Do you want him to, you think about this. Everybody in this room also has been caught up in sin. If you haven't, then you're lying to everybody and yourself as well. Right, we've all been caught up and struggled with sin at different times, whatever sin that might be. Do you want Dad to show up when you're in the middle of that? That's why he did the parable about the bride, the brides and the grooms and the husband come and the groom and the oil, and be ready. He says you need to be ready. That's why he says set your mind on heavenly things. That's what the answer to this one is. Set on heavenly things. We're looking forward to what he's got. Who's got the next verse? 1 Thessalonians. You got that, Kerm? Oh, go ahead, Marcus.
And may the Lord make you increase in abound in love for one another and for all that you, so that you may establish your hearts blameless and holiness before our God and Father in the coming of our Lord Jesus with all the saints.
Yeah. So what should happen? What should happen? Our love should increase. It's interesting because there's a direct contradiction, not a contradiction, but opposite of this stated in scriptures. It says at the end times, people's hearts will grow cold. But true believers' hearts should soften and grow warm. And that verse isn't just love your other fellow Christians, it's love, period. So while everybody else, and we're in a cancel culture where everybody hates each other, and if you don't agree with me, I hate you and you hate me, we're supposed to increase in love. That's not easy to do when people hate you. But we're called to increase in love. Love one another. And that love one another is not just referring to the context of people in the church, it's outside the church too, because the second greatest commandment is love your neighbor. Didn't say that your neighbor was a believer or not. We're supposed to love. That's supposed to grow. Next verse. Hebrews 10:25. Go ahead, read it, buddy. Go ahead, read Hebrews 10:25. Absolutely, I'm with you. The day approaching is the return of Jesus Christ. And so people should desire to get together in church. Church attendance should increase. COVID attendance causes churches to decrease. True believers start to increase. Why? They want to be together. So not just love for outside the church, which is not always easy to do. There should be this love for one another in the church that wants us to get together and spend time with one another. James 5:7-8, who has that? Go ahead, Deb.
Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waiting for the land to yield its valuable crop. Patiently wait for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient, stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near.
Okay, what should we be patient? Our patience should grow. But what was he referring to? He's talking about the fields. He's talking about the crops. What's the harvest? Harvest of believers. We should be patient and understand that God is patient and wanting everyone to come to repentance. We should be patient and waiting for the return of Christ because we desire for more people to get saved. We desire that. But I'll be honest with you, I struggle a little bit with that. I want it to come. I really do. I want it to come. And I don't know that that's a bad thing, but we should have patience knowing that God's timing is perfect. Correct? 1 John 3:2-3. Who's got that? Go ahead.
Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we should be like him, for we shall see him as he is.
What's that telling us that we need to do? I wrote down we need to be clean.
You didn't go to verse 3 yet.
Go ahead, read.
Sorry, all who have this hope in him purify themselves just as he is pure.
Purify ourselves. So we want to be clean. We want to be purified. We want to be clean. Who's got Jude 20-23? The reason there's no chapter in there is because there's only one chapter in the book of Jude. Who's got that? Second to last book, guys.
But you, beloved, building yourselves up in the most holy faith and praying in the Holy Spirit.
Keep going.
Yourselves in the love of God, waiting for the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ that leads to eternal life. And have mercy on those who doubt. Save others by snatching them out of the fire. The others show mercy with fear, hating even the garment stained by the blood.
What's that tell us we should be doing as the day grows near? He's telling us, snatching them out of the fire. Did you hear that? Talk about it. So people should be going to hell by ripping themselves out of our hand and leaping into the fiery pit. We should be snatching people out of hell. What else did it say? We should be what? What else? Keeping God's love. There was another thing we're supposed to do. Snatching some out of hell. Showing mercy to those. You want to see how you grow in your love? Show mercy. Be a person of mercy. You know what's interesting about that? You do a spiritual gift test. There's one gender that tends to have that gift more than others. And it's not us guys. No, Ben's pointing to himself. No, you're not, Ben. Yeah, it's your wife. Yeah, he's pointing to his wife. Yeah. Women tend to have that gift much higher than men. We don't do a good job of showing mercy. We don't show, and mercy is exactly what Jesus Christ showed us. We should be snatching some out of the fire. That means sharing Jesus Christ with them. We should be pushing them towards Jesus Christ. Others we need to show mercy to. Why? We're sinners just like them. Last one. We should be 1 Thessalonians 4, chapter 4, verses 16-18. Who's got that?
For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with the cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the sound of the trumpet of God. The dead in Christ will rise first, then we who are alive and who are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words.
What does that tell us that we should? It's a promise, but what should that remove or help us with as we get closer?
What do you mean?
How does that affect me today? How does that affect me as I grow? There's a good word. Peace. What else? Encourage. Here's what I said. We should lose our fear of death. We should lose our fear of death. Why? We know where we're going. That verse, which is talking about the rapture, by the way, that is talking about the exact rapture, whether that's pre, mid, or post, we haven't determined yet. But that's the rapture. That's us going up in the air. We're going to be caught up in the air with Jesus Christ. We know. And it says the dead in Christ will rise first, correct? So we know, I don't care if I've been cremated. I don't care if sharks ate my body and I'm scattered in all the feces throughout the ocean. I'm going to get caught up. God can figure out how to put that crap back together again, which is where Michelle would say I came from. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, crap to crap. So I know it's Ash Wednesday, so that's a little different kind of version of Ash Wednesday. So God's going to be able to put all that back together, and he's going to bring you up. And that should remove that whole idea of fear. And we should be able to look forward to that. And these are the things that I just came up with in the New Testament that I see that should cause us to be different. And the reason that we should be interested in studying the book of Revelation. We didn't get to it this week. We'll get to it next week. Here's one thing I'm not going to do. I'm not going to shove us through at a fast pace. If we have to slow down, we will continue to slow down. But in the first 3 or 4 verses, it tells us that you are blessed for reading the book of Revelations. It's the only book that tells you you're blessed at the beginning to read it, and you're cursed at the end if you change it. And so you're blessed if you read it. These are the reasons you're blessed. This is the things that we should be looking forward to, and this is how it should affect me as a Christian right now, knowing that that third cylinder is still yet to start. And when that rapture happens, whether it's pre, mid, or post, is going to happen. And so those are the things that we should look forward to. Any comments or questions? We're finishing up right here. This is week 1 of lots of weeks. I'm not even going to give you a number. Yeah. We might be doing this until the rapture comes. If all of a sudden one day that most of us aren't here and you are still here, Sharon, you'll know. You're going to have to either teach the class yourself or you didn't learn well. I'm just teasing.
I like how at the beginning you talked about describing in your own words, because I've never heard that before. And if you read some of this really crazy stuff that John writes down in Saul, if you just saw tanks, he'd have no idea.
He'd have no clue what those look like. And so as we get into the bowls and the seals and stuff, and we start to do that, I'm going to help you imagine what that, if he was thinking along that lines, what that actually could be to people who've seen it through the eyes of understanding the technology and the science of today. So, hey, let me close this in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Lord, I thank you for our night tonight. I thank you that we get to begin this study that we're blessed to start. We're blessed to spend time in this word. We're blessed to spend time in this book. And Lord, we learn some of the things that we should be looking forward to, how it should change us today, what we should be doing or not doing based off of knowing that you are returning a second time. And Lord, I pray for that. I look forward to it. I'm excited for it, but I understand why we need to be patient because, Lord, you desire all to come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And Lord, I pray that we be part of that. You have decided to use the church to be the facilitator, to be the movement behind the gospel. And I pray, Lord, that you help us to be that in our lives, the way we live, the way we speak, the way we talk, and the way we are. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.